Good morning and welcome to our regular, almost kind of weekly sort of live stream slash podcast. Uh, we are here, the authors of I Do Not Think That Word Means What You Think It Means, a short handbook of misunderstanding available on Amazon. We highly recommend that everybody encourage all their friends to buy it. It's the perfect gift for people you disagree with on the internet. We're here today to talk about jobs, wages, and unemployment. This is a kind of an interesting and in the news topic today, given that the United States published what was widely deemed a very, very disappointing jobs report. And a lot of people have a lot of disagreements as to kind of what are the causes of that. And that's kind of the jumping off point. Additionally, Matthew sent me kind of an interesting meme earlier in this week about kind of um, a theory on jobs and as to whether or not jobs are good or bad, or ways to build wealth and prosperity or not. And we'll discuss a little bit of that. So, just jumping right in, the United States reported job growth of 266,000 jobs in the month of April, which in normal times is actually a great number, but given the level of unemployment that exists and kind of the trend that we've been on, and the amount of stimulus and the reopening that's been happening in the U.S. economy, people expected a much, much bigger number, closer to 1 million jobs. The lower end estimates were 500,000. So this, by all means, was a very disappointing number. Some people jumped right up from the right, primarily jumped up to say, "Oh, it's all that unexpanded unemployment money that's disincentivizing workers," and I'm not sure. The prevailing opinion was, nope, it's not that. My personal opinion is it's probably a combination of factors. One is, yes, people are definitely disincentivized to work when they can make more money sitting at home. But I think more importantly, actually, are issues having to do with childcare. Excuse me. Where children have been out of school for a very long time in many locations. Parents, particularly mothers, feel they can't return to work when their kids are not properly taken care of, which makes perfect sense to me. And there's another kind of subset of the population that is just straight up still afraid of COVID and doesn't want to go outside, and so therefore believes that getting a job is kind of dangerous to their safety. Thoughts on that, Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, where to go from there? I liked the meme because it, like a lot of memes, it sort of condensed and conflated a lot of ideas in a sort of manipulative and persuasive way. Shimon, do you have it? Do you want me to
Yeah,
post it on?
I'll pull it up.
Great. The thing I liked about it, I think, was that it's like I really agree with it, and then I also feel like it totally misrepresents sort of three or four different issues that are wrapped up. Like, we live in this world where it is not easy to cope on a day-to-day basis with living in most countries that I know of unless you have something that we usually call a job. If you don't have a job, you better have some sort of income from somewhere. But most people are not owners of businesses, and you could argue whether most people even have any you might say, talent or understanding or inclination to actually start or run their own businesses. So I don't want to deep dive into the idea of whether anyone needs to work at all, but like, there is a case to be made, which I think this meme is making, that if you don't work, if you don't have a job, then you could be homeless, and you could have no way to put food into your face, and and if you don't spend a sort of minimum of a third of your life at a job, you can't afford to have a house and have food. That's the implication, and I think for a lot of people in countries where in places where if you don't have the income of a full-time job, you can't afford housing or food, which is at least some places. This is a legitimate narrative, I guess I would say. There's an implicit coercion that if you don't work, you're out on the street. And I'm not sure that we want to live in a society where that's how it works. But now we're seeing sort of the hazard with these sort of extended COVID unemployment benefits and stimuluses and stuff, that it turns out the threshold is not that high for some people to, hey, if I have enough income without having a job, I'd rather not work. And, the one layer on top of that, which I think, Shimon, you have a lot of insight into, is perverse incentives. It's like, if the payments coming out of the unemployment, if you just lose them if you start working, and if by working you can't make a whole lot more than you get by keeping the benefits, you are literally incentivized to not work and keep sponging off of this system. So there's been experiments with UBI where you don't lose your payments, your whatever, if you start working. So that would be a different incentive system. So that's where I kind of see this going, is like, are we coercing everybody to work? And if we start giving people so that they're not coerced to work, how do we handle that in such a way that the whole economy doesn't grind to a halt and restaurants have to close because they can't find waiters and stuff? So I sort of hear those issues embedded in this sort of argument that everyone's having today, that, hey, nobody's even taking the jobs that are available. There's help wanted signs up everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there was a headline this morning just before we went on that there were 8.1 million job openings at the end of March in the United States economy. And I know people who are in the restaurant business that are finding it near impossible to hire talent. And it's a kind of a rough ride for anybody who's out there, when like literally the incentive currently is to not have to work. And look, I'm not of the extreme fringe view that well, maybe it's not fringe, but I'm not of the extreme view that 100% of the reason why people are not taking jobs today has to do with the fact that that people are getting paid more to sit at home. And I've had conversations with a number of people that do work even though they could make more money sitting at home. But they feel like they're better suited for their future to have the job because they can then achieve growth. I think the bigger kind of the impact at the moment is the school thing. The fact that even here in Southern California, like I know of a person who their school is now 3 days a week, and it's from 8 to 12, and the mother or father, but a parent has to drop the kid off at 8. There's no bus service, and they have to be there at 12 o'clock to pick them up. Well, like, how do you kind of work that in with having a job in today's world? And many employers are being very understanding of this, but it's still kind of crazy that you have to kind of take off a couple hours in the middle of the day to go and do that. So I think but to your bigger point, look, I don't know of very many societies where one can just afford to live en masse without having a job. Like, I think that's kind of a requirement, unless you're of some kind of independent wealth or a complete ward of the state. I mean, I don't really see how. Like, I can understand how potentially in the future there could be this conversation about UBI when we, as a society, can produce way more with very little effort than is needed, and literally most jobs can be outsourced to automation. And we might have to kind of get there, but at the moment, and in the moment, I don't see that as a requirement. Now, we can have a conversation about wages and prevailing wages and the value thereof and incentives. I think that you're right. I think we need to find better incentive structures as a society to get people to not just sit on the government handout. Although that at some point is going to have to disappear, or maybe it doesn't. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Saudi Arabia has, in effect, just been paying an awful lot of its citizens sort of enough to live. I think,
but that's coming to an end.
Perhaps, yeah, but I don't think it's some vague thing in the future. I think there are a lot of things that are close enough to it that we can say that the UBI is kind of already part of our world, especially because of the way COVID was handled. Like in Europe, almost all of European countries just gave people money to stay at home, especially for the first several months of COVID. And it was a lot of money. I don't know. I mean, very often both of us push against sort of a prevailing narrative. You brought up two really good reasons why the money might not be the issue at all with respect to people going back to work at like high contact indoor jobs, like being a waiter at a restaurant. It could either be because of a still fear of COVID, which obviously a huge chunk of the population is terrified about, wants the vaccine, or is scared of people who don't have the vaccine, or is scared of people who have the vaccine. I don't even know. Then there's people who, like you said, because of all the ridiculousness with schools being in person or not, that brings up a slightly different issue, which is that in America, childcare is not particularly incentivized or subsidized in the ways that it is in a lot of Western European countries. But you've got an awful lot of parents who are just simply not in a position to go back to work because what are they going to leave their 7-year-old kid home alone? It's not a realistic option. So either one of those might be a bigger reason. And when you're talking about a huge job market, a slight downward pressure on your incentive to go take a certain job might cause this sort of industry-wide shortage. So I don't like the journalism that sort of presumes that there's one answer to this. Like, oh, well, we're paying them too much money. Right.
No, paying too much money definitely doesn't help the situation. But I understand that it was necessary for a period of time, assuming that the lockdowns were necessary, and that's kind of a whole separate debate. But when you shut down the economy and you stop people from working, then you have to give them some kind of means of support. I've heard lots of criticism that the United States didn't do a very good job of it, but I mean, empirically, I think that doesn't make a lot of sense, given that, I mean, there are certainly marginalized communities that didn't have access to these things. But for a good portion, through the thick of the pandemic, the extra unemployment benefit amounted to $15 an hour, on top of the regular state. That was $600 a week for, I think it ran through September of 2020, from April. So just that $600 a week extra amounts to $15 an hour, on top of most states had somewhere between $200 and $300 of weekly unemployment insurance as well from the state level, which kind of amounts to people are making $22, $25, even $30 an hour in some places, literally not working. But once again, when you've shut down the economy, you've shut down the economy. But I think the broader thing is kind of what forward, right? What's the next kind of step, and how do we step out of this? Because look, I think where I think this conversation most frequently goes off the rails, specifically when it comes around to minimum wage, which the meme kind of seems to like be it, where the meme starts to kind of really be hinting at, is that the minimum wage is not really meant to be the prevailing wage, and it isn't. If you look at the minimum wage statistics, the vast majority of people who earn the minimum wage, first of all, I just looked them up right here, and it's hard to get real 100% accurate statistics, but these are the federal statistics, which run on the federal minimum wage, because many states have other minimum wages that are above the federal minimum wage. But at the federal minimum wage in 1979, 15% of the country worked. 15% of the people who worked at the federal minimum wage. In 2020, that number dropped to 1.5%. Who are these people that are working for minimum wage? And the answer is mostly teenagers. Yes, is there the odd person who is working, who's trying to support a family on the minimum wage? They do exist. I'm not saying they don't exist, but by and large, most people working minimum wage is designed to give you an entryway into the job market. And I'm having spoken to employers I'm quite afraid of what's happening to wages specifically in California, but other places where, look, at the end of the day, a company takes in however many dollars it takes in at the top, right? And then it has all these expenses, and then kind of at the bottom is profit, right? And one of the numbers that has a very large impact on a company's profits, depending on what company they are, not the Amazons and Facebooks of the world, where the marginal cost of production is zero, but in most service industries and in most goods producing industries, that wage is a large component of that. And if you bump up wages, then you wipe out all profit. And if there's no profit, then the company can't stay in business unless you're talking about completely socializing an economy, which, I mean, I'm not such a huge fan of personally, and I haven't seen a lot of really stunning examples of success of that in kind of in the modern world or ever in history. So like, and that's really what it comes down to, is like, there's only so much you can afford. And the biggest problem of all of this is, as minimum wage goes up, it's harder to get that entry level job. And this is going to hardest hit the underprivileged people of society, the minorities, getting your first job is important because that's where you learn how to work, and that's where you learn the value of work. And I mean, you need to learn how to show up on time. You need to learn how to behave in a workplace environment. You need to learn a bunch of skills that don't just come naturally, and they're not really taught in school. And so people are just not going to have that opportunity to get those jobs as the minimum wage goes up, because the amount of work that I, as an employer, need to see production as the wage climbs up, is the math doesn't pencil. The company I work for used to have a very large summer internship program, and that summer internship program basically hired any teenage kid that kind of wanted a job, because wages were relatively cheap, and we just put them to work scanning. And a lot of those kids ultimately ended up working for the company down the road after the summer. They would take after school jobs, or when they finished school, they would kind of get full-time jobs. And I mean, it's a real estate company, so sometimes it was maintenance, sometimes it was call center, sometimes depending on the person's kind of aptitude. But that program has been completely abolished because the work, the value of the work was not enough to justify the prevailing wage in Southern California, which is now coming up on $15 an hour. So there just is no internship program anymore, and all of those interns are no longer able to access the job market in the same way.
There's several rabbit holes you opened up there. One of them is, look, if it's only 1.5% of American jobs that are working at minimum wage, then it in theory, it wouldn't impact businesses much to raise the minimum wage, because most jobs wouldn't be affected by that. But I think you're saying something a little different. Obviously, there's a large number of low-income workers who are, farm labor.
Let me interrupt you for a second. Sorry. I don't oppose raising the federal minimum wage from 7.25, although I think minimum wages in general are perverted, and we can get into that in a second. But raising the minimum wage, they're not talking about raising the minimum wage. They're talking about more than doubling the federal minimum wage. And that's going to devastate large swaths of the U.S. economy and remove the ability to of people to kind of learn, work, and climb the ladder. So carry on.
I would agree more with the second part of that than the first part. The impacts of raising a minimum wage aren't necessarily devastating, like in Australia or whatnot. It didn't necessarily devastate the economy, but it definitely changes the incentives of businesses to hire and or to automate. You have a lot more incentive to automate processes that are done by cheap labor. I tend to push in the other direction, which is that it's the baseline cost of living. Like, how much does a poor person need to get by? A number for a minimum wage is meaningless to me if you don't tell me what the index is for them to get basic, safe, reasonable housing and healthcare, and I don't know what's the absolute minimum you need to live. In a place like Colombia or China, where I've spent some time, there are extremely poor neighborhoods or extremely low cost neighborhoods, which are fairly close to wealthier neighborhoods and then close to the centers of cities where there's lots of jobs and opportunities, minimum wage can be quite low, and yet you can be in the black. You can be making more money than you spend each month without a ridiculous commute and without an onerous slave work schedule. I did see this firsthand. I had a friend who was running a couple of hostels, and he was employing 15, 20 Colombians at roughly close to double the minimum wage. Minimum wage is extremely low. The minimum wage there is like, I don't know, $500 a month or something. And he was paying them close to double that, but still well lower than I thought it would have taken. And he said, look, if I pay more than that, it actually doesn't make sense, because you kind of are in the market that you're in. You're going to hire people at the level that you want. So there's another implicit, I don't want to say a lie, but when they say that all these businesses can't hire, is it that they can't hire, or that they can't hire at the wage that they're offering? And there are many factors that go into whether
wherein is the difference between those two kind of positions. So like I know people who own a restaurant, right? And I don't know exactly what they're currently paying in wages, right? But they've worked a long time and built up their capital, right? Worked and saved and invested in a business, right? And now that business is their livelihood, right? So they both work in the business, and what do they make is what's left after they've paid all their employees, right? They're the last ones to get paid, not the first, right?
Correct.
And so if all of the sudden the level of wage that they need to offer to hire the people that they need to staff the business is higher than all of the profit, right? Then they can't hire people. They cannot. That will put them out of business. Like I did this exercise a number of years ago, just in regards to Walmart, because Walmart is a ready target of this kind of minimum wage as wage abusers, etc. And I took, this is on my Facebook page from a number of years ago, but I can run it again. I took a snapshot of their financial statements, right? And you look at the revenue at the top line, and you look at the net profit at the bottom, and their net profit margin, something on the order of 2%. It's billions and billions of dollars. But then they were talking then about raising the minimum wage. So let's just assume that that Walmart, bumps every employee $1 an hour, and you multiply that out times 2080, which is the number of official work hours a year, assuming a 5-day work week, 8 hours a day with 2 weeks vacation. That's just the math, right? And you add all of that cost into the bottom line, just $1, right? And we're not even talking about the full $15 that people were asking for at the time, right? And without changing any other factors, that company is out of business. They do not have the money to make all of the payments that they need to make to stay in business. So the answer then is raise prices, right? Which it's fine. But then the people who work at Walmart for the very low wages rely on companies like Walmart to sell goods cheaply enough for them to survive. And now, so you're hitting them from both sides.
Correct. I mean, the missing pieces of the formula there are what are their other costs and whether those are sort of perverse incentives. Like if,
nobody should live in Southern California. It doesn't make sense.
Right. So this is where I'm going. Like the level of taxation and the real estate costs are both, I don't want to say artificially inflated, but there's a whole set of actors making choices that wind up affecting the profitability of businesses and the ability of businesses to offer either low or high wages. If it's, if to own a big box store in Southern California, if you're paying $500,000, I don't know, a month of some sort of taxes and fees and everything, you're going to have a really low margin, or you might even be operating at a loss But as part of sort of your larger share of the economy, it still might be worth it in one way or another. And if there's a shortage of, like, the biggest income, or I should say the biggest expense for most families under a certain threshold is rent. And then, their other biggest expense is probably healthcare. Healthcare in the United States is a whole other rabbit hole. We're not going to go down there right now, except to say that even if you have like the best Obamacare, whatever, you're still going to have potentially several $1,000s a year in medical expenses.
So then can we agree then, based on the directions that you're going down with your arguments, can we agree that fixing the wage is not the answer? Like, artificially changing how much people make doesn't change the calculus at the end of the day. Like, there are other externalities that are much, much bigger that weigh into this, which have to do with the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing, all these other costs. And that's fine. Like, we can talk about how to address those issues. But I think from the perspective of wage, right, you can't solve those problems by increasing wage. My answer to somebody who says we need a $15 minimum wage, my question is always the same. Why not 100?
Depending on their orientation, they might agree with you on that.
Sure, but that's the ultimate logic. Where does it end up, right? Because it's all a cycle. It's all a circle, right?
Well, okay, so circle. Now you're talking about something that I think is very interesting, which is like, what's the pie as a whole? What are we doing with this pie as a whole? Because people tend to act like a dollar is worth a dollar. But we're actually experiencing, I think, a greater inflation at this moment in time than America has in at least 30 years, probably since like the early 80s or something.
And we're going to see a lot more given the current kind of direction we're heading.
Or even just having it catch up to the amount of money that was printed since the beginning of Corona or since the 2008 crash. The amount of money that's been printed is supposed to have a pretty direct relationship to the value of the currency. And we printed a lot more currency, but nominally, at least, it didn't go up. We've talked about this in another podcast, that asset prices went up, house costs went up, but it wasn't experienced as inflation the way we conventionally define it, which seems to be a basket of goods. And I think there was a scandal very recently where they suddenly changed the basket of goods because they didn't like how much inflation it seemed to show. But leaving aside all the complexity of that, a dollar might not be a dollar. Let's agree on that.
Mm-hmm.
So if a dollar might not be a dollar, I can understand if the only lever you have access to as a voter or as a politician in a hurry, you might say, I can't deal with all the other problems. I don't know how to build enough housing because there's so much red tape to get enough housing built to catch up with demand, that housing is what it is. I can't fix it right away. So I'd rather just force wages up because I can do that in one fell swoop. So I can't tell them that they're totally wrong in the sense that it doesn't solve the problem, but it might push on part of the problem in a way that allows more people to come closer to breaking even. It might backfire. It might what else were we saying? Like if there
are two problems with that analysis, in my opinion, and possibly more. But
there's more than two. I didn't even finish.
I readily identified two. One is that the dynamics of cost of living are local; they're not national. Okay, so to stand from the federal level and say my lever of power is to push on the wage is BS, because in like rural Alabama, right? And I don't know what's going on in the economy of rural Alabama, but $7.25 an hour might be plenty to live on. And if you double it to 15, you may put the farm out of business, completely throw the local economy into an inflationary spin. Where in California, you didn't even move the needle because California prevailing minimum wage is already $15 an hour. So you didn't help anybody like there. So trying to solve large, complex problems using a simple solution from the federal level is ridiculous. And we should stop trying to do that.
I hear what you're saying. I think you would disagree when we bring up certain other issues. Like sometimes you point to the very complexity of problems as the problem itself, and sometimes you need to just simplify things on a much broader level. For example, lowering capital gains tax or something might have a huge beneficial effect all across America from your perspective. I'm just saying, like, you might agree with that sentence. If they suddenly dropped capital gains tax,
but that's not
federally,
a complex. But that's not a complex problem. Like the problem of tax has to do with federal revenue, right? You're playing around. Those are fairly simple levers. Now there may be a lot of moving parts, and you may create a bunch of other incentives. But I'm not. There's not a knock-on problem. The problem there is I'm trying to decide for federal revenue, and you have to make a decision as to and the studies and history tend to bear this out. You can charge higher tax rates, but that doesn't in practice really increase your federal revenue versus, and this is a debate, right? Whether does increasing taxes necessarily increase federal revenue? I would argue that the data show that it does not. In fact, and this is where statistics get to be kind of crazy and way out there because I see them all the time. There's all this idea of like the Trump tax cuts, blah, 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 cost this much. And that's BS because if you go back and look at the Internal Revenue Service collection statistics, how much money revenue the Treasury took in from when the tax cuts kicked in till now, it's gone up every year, right? So, yeah, I will lambaste the Republicans for not being the fiscal hawks that they pretended to be in the Obama years, okay? But that is all on the spending side and not on the revenue side. It is, as far as I can tell, and I'm happy to see statistics from other people who disagree with me, it is uncontested that the Trump tax cuts or the Republican tax cuts of 2017, the Tax Reform Act, increased federal revenue in real terms.
primarily by closing loopholes or by what?
But through a number of things, and I can't pretend to tell you them all, but even corporate tax receipts are up, by the way. And that's easy. That's like you took away the incentive to offshore profits, right? But through a 1-2 punch. One is you lowered your domestic tax rate, right? And two is you penalize people for offshoring profits. And by utilizing those two levers, corporate tax revenue has increased every year since 2017.
Okay, well, wait. So let's back it up a sec because I agree with some of what you're saying. I still am not sure that I was making a general sort of statement about minimum wage, and you took it in the direction of the problem being federal versus local, that the one size fits all might not work. And so I pushed back with the capital gains, one size fits all. But I would tend to agree, actually, that state income tax has a pretty significant impact on like people moving from California to Texas recently and whatever. And look, those are experiments, and under certain circumstances, like I know Massachusetts has very high taxes, but actually attracts a lot of business because of the way it uses its state revenue to support certain kinds of businesses. But California seems to be, let's just charitably say, not generating that sort of goodwill from businesses recently. But you said there was two problems with what I said before. What was
right?
The second?
So one is trying to nationalize a local problem, and the second is that even on the local level, you're not solving the underlying problems. Like so you have to determine where the local level is, right? So the local level, obviously, you might argue is the state, so in California, watch this happen, okay? Long Beach, the city that I live in, was one of the earliest cities out there in California to say, we're going to a $15 minimum wage. And they, in a lot of ways, led the state, right? And I mean, the state was going there anyway, right? And so the argument from kind of businesses in Long Beach, and actually this is kind of back to my general pet peeve about the way you can manipulate numbers and statistics and reports. The Long Beach Economic Development Commission, they commissioned a study, basically, what will be the impact on raising Long Beach's minimum wage. And the study was like 80 pages or something like that. And I actually read through the study because I was talking to local council people at the time about whether or not raising the minimum wage in Long Beach was a good idea or a bad idea. And I mean, my bias, obviously, led me to argue that it was a bad idea. But I just reading the commission report, there was an executive summary that was 2 pages, right? And then there was an 80-page report behind it. And if you read the 80-page report and you read the executive summary, you could not believe that they came from the same underlying study.
It's like headlines in journalism.
It's worse than headlines in journalism. It's like every point in the study shows that if Long Beach in a vacuum raises wages, it's going to drive jobs away from Long Beach and into the neighboring cities. Because if Long Beach's wages are $2 an hour more than Huntington Beach's wages, which or Lakewood, which is like 4 minutes from my house, I'm in Lakewood, right? And Long Beach actually has an even better case study because, like, I don't know how many years ago, decades ago, there's a city called Signal Hill, which effectively seceded from Long Beach. Okay, it's an island in the middle of Long Beach, right? And when you go to Signal Hill, all you see are big businesses, car dealerships, Costco's there, all the big box stores are there. Why? Right? Because Signal Hill made a play for the business dollars because the economy is local, right? When it's that close. So if the state bumped wages to $15 an hour, right? And Long Beach is just following along. So there's no competitive advantage in the short run, right? To change wages, to change the wage pressures.
Okay. So this is where it ties back into the meme. Because what you're implying with so many of these things where you're saying wage pressures, you're talking about the kinds of jobs that implicitly are going to be close to the minimum wage. You're talking about jobs that are fairly low end. And low end implies a lot of different things. Like one of my questions whenever I see, employers claim that they have all these unfilled jobs is like, well, there's been times where I was looking for a job and they're looking to hire for jobs, but somehow we're not finding each other. And they claim they can't find the right people and they'll leave a job unfilled for 6 months or a year or more. And it's like, there's thousands of qualified candidates out there. So there's some inefficiencies built into this system, and some of them could be solved. Like, hey, you can't find someone, offer a higher salary, and there's, there's actually specifically with respect to restaurants, there's a lot of evidence like from France that where tips are not a separate thing. They're built into the check and they're built into the salary. You don't have this weird incentive system. It's considered a more respectable profession to be a waiter, waitress, maitre d', fancy word, fancy French word. That's they have higher loyalty, higher quality service, longer term sort of investment and commitment of wait staff to a restaurant, and better, it results in better service for customers and higher quality restaurants. And I know people who live in Switzerland will literally just go to France for lunch because Switzerland's a small country. But like the food's better and it's cheaper than Switzerland because Switzerland's like the California of Europe with absurdly high taxes, although California probably has better food than Switzerland. But the point being, when you talk about the lower wages, it's like if a business is successful, they should be figuring out how to hire and retain the best people to be the most productive. And nobody who's ever tried to run a business would tell you that, hiring 5 low wage people and just trying to train them is going to be as cost effective as having 3 people who have experience and know what they're doing are probably twice as effective as 5 people you're just trying to get up there who don't even like the job and don't want to be doing it, but they, quote, need a job. So this comes back to this idea of there being this sort of fear-driven floor that, like, hey, you have to work or you'll be out in the street. And therefore you take crappy jobs that you don't like and you don't do a good job at them just to have a job. And there's business models of the McDonald's of the world where they don't aspire to hire anybody except the people who don't want that job. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but you know what I'm saying. So this is where I think it gets interesting, because almost any business that, like your business, you work in a company that helps do a bunch of different things. Very few of your employees are minimum wage. It's just not relevant to the business that you're in.
I mean, there are certainly minimum wage positions that in the company that I work for, and those will over time be phased out as minimum wage rises, because those are largely repetitive jobs that it's cheaper for the company to keep these people to do these jobs rather than train the computer to do them for them, if that makes sense. But as the wage goes up, right, and this is the ultimate at the end of the day, and so I don't necessarily want to go down this rabbit hole, but this is a piece of the conversation, is that as the wage goes up, the business owner is incentivized to find more high qualified people, right, and pay them more, right? But as you said, right, I'm replacing 5 with 3. And that's doable in certain industries and certain sectors, and not in all cases, right? Some things are just menial, right? Somebody has to, if you're going to have waiters, somebody has to wait the tables, take the orders, right? Now, a lot of restaurants are moving away from the table service model, right? Because they can't afford it, right? So it's fundamentally changing. But what's happening at the end of the day, right, is that you now have less jobs, not more jobs. And so I don't disagree in principle, and we've had this conversation before, with the kind of the long-term solution of a UBI in principle, right? Where all of the quote menial jobs in society disappear. I mean, Eric Weinstein put an article a number of years ago, which I thought was pretty fascinating. I don't remember the name of it, but I can look it up and put it into the comments later. But basically, he said, look, there's two kinds of jobs in the world. Right? One is highly repeatable, right? Low skill. Right, it's just you're just kind of living in a kind of a complex Rube Goldberg machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the other are differentiated tasks each time, right? Things that require thought, right? And in the long run, it's just a matter of price for the first category of jobs to disappear, right? When the wage price hits a certain level, and whatever that level is, and it's different for different jobs, right? Those jobs just disappear. They're gone, right? Why? Because it is now become cheaper, right? So two things are happening. One is the cost of technology will come down, and the other, as the price of labor is being pushed up, those jobs are just gone. And now we are, as a society, going to have to negotiate and figure out how to handle that and how to get through it successfully. And I think that in the long run, we will have no choice but to go for some kind of UBI, freedom dividend, et cetera. But I think we need to be very careful in how we implement that.
I agree.
And that's going to be a huge debate, but we're not even there yet. Because we're not there. I think the bigger problem is back to where I said there were two issues. The locality of it, right, is that at the end of the day, right, like I said before, nobody should live in Southern California unless they're a high wage employee. And what will end up happening is, as more low wage employees exit the market, right, the
wages will drive up.
The wages will have to go up, and the cost of living will go down, right? The market is just out of equilibrium. For some stupid reason, way too many people want to live in LA County. I don't know why, by the way. And people are finally starting to wake up and realize this, which is why California, for the first time in 30 years, experienced an actual net population decline. And we've had out migration for 7 years, net out migration for 7 years.
Right, and that's also, like I said before, that the perverse incentive of all the NIMBYism has made it's not that there's too many people want to live in LA County, it's that too many people want to live in LA County based on the supply and price of housing, because there's been these perverse incentives that prevented builders, landlords, developers from building and or subdividing their existing properties so that you could have enough people live there. I think it's a very self-defeating behavior. Um, uh, America and Europe during, and I guess maybe other countries during COVID, took an accidental large step towards a UBI experimentation. That's what I would call it. So
I
that's
don't know that
why
it was an accident.
fair. It might not be an accident. It made me uncomfortable because it wasn't. If we had, as we say, owned it, that it was an experiment in UBI, I think it actually could have, because what's way more important with UBI is to change the ethics of work and jobs and the values underneath it. I don't think that jobs are priced appropriately or valued appropriately. I think the market might be a good measure, or not measure, in theory, a pure market would value jobs correctly because it's worth what people pay you to do it, right? It just is what it is, and the price sort of naturally emerges from people looking for work and people finding work, and employers looking for employees who want to do that job, and how much they have to pay to get someone to do that job.
But so why does it not work? Yeah.
Well, there's a bunch of reasons it could not work, even in a quote pure market environment. I can imagine situations where, well, there's always dangers of corruption. There's always dangers of some of the perverse incentives we discussed before. When there isn't a pure market for housing, which would create enough supply for cheap housing, then how is the market going to correctly determine wages? Because you're basically in a situation where your market for housing is so high that you kind of have to get a higher wage. So it's not a free market in that sense. I would say if there was a free market, it would have to be all the things.
Well, okay, so I would agree that a more freedom of markets is better than less freedom of markets, and if the supply of housing was able to grow to meet the demand of housing without all these other kind of perversions in the way, then the cost of living relative to prevailing wages would be lower in Southern California. Now, there are plenty of places where this does work, by the way. So, I know we've talked about this before. The wages in Nevada, the next state over, that has no state minimum wage, they have a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Same work, same job, different wages. The wages are higher in Nevada that has no minimums, right? Or
and
that,
much
that where their minimums are so low, as to not really be existent, right?
And but they have affordable housing.
And they have more affordable housing. Now, I happen to believe that fundamental is going to change over the next number of years for a number of reasons. But part of it has to do with kind of the demand. That what's happening in Nevada right now is that the demand for labor is higher than the supply of labor, right? And for whatever reason, people prefer to live in California than they do prefer in Los Angeles than they do to live in Las Vegas. Now it's changing, right? As more and more people outwardly migrate from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, right? So the supply of labor will go up. Mind you, the demand for labor should also go up, and the supply of housing at some point is going to reach an outer bound. Now, you could say Las Vegas Valley is a pretty large open space in the desert, so there's some limit, but so there's a lot less restriction on the supply of housing. But back to the same thing, right? Wage, and enforcing controls on wage, in my opinion, it solves nothing. In the long run, maybe in the very short run, it solves something, but in the long run, it solves nothing.
Yeah, I'd be inclined to agree with you. Look, like I said, it can make sense. If you're an actor in the political arena, you only have leverage over certain pieces of it. And if you have more leverage over that than you have over NIMBYism and you have over the controlled supply of housing or the healthcare system or whatever, maybe the brute force of just raising a wage, it might help narrowly defined. And yeah, I can agree that
Oh,
that's probably
it's politically expedient.
no, but I'm saying explicitly for the people who are working for wages at or near that, it might be helpful. But I want to go back to what you said about Eric Weinstein saying there's two types of job in the world, because I actually disagree with that. But I go by David Graeber's idea of there being kind of several types of jobs in the world that are bullshit. Like the world would actually be better off if you weren't doing that job at all and you're making things worse. And then there's other jobs where you are doing something worthwhile. And then there's other jobs where you're doing something worthwhile and interesting and creative. And the pay scales for these might be very, very different. So some people really, really like doing physical labor. Like I just got to do, and I took this job because I had been on Corona lockdown for a couple months, and it was like, I need to get out of the house. Gyms aren't even open yet. And I got offered a chance to go work construction of archaeological sites near the center of Jerusalem. That was intrinsically interesting and valuable to me for the sake of, being interested in the archaeology and the place and the significance and the religious significance and all these things. I also was actually excited to do it because it was physically extremely difficult labor, because I was out of shape after sitting in my house for 2 months. I wanted to work. I was like, why would I pay to go to a gym when I could get paid to work? But it was still barely above the minimum wage, even for Israel. It wasn't, quote, good money. But the decision I was making was, compared to sitting on my ass, working for barely above the minimum wage, doing heavy labor, was actually desirable. In other circumstances, I or a lot of other people would be like, I don't want to do physically hard labor. But in some ways, and especially for a lot of the guys that I saw working there, physically hard labor was itself rewarding. It's like I'm doing something real. I'm not just typing imaginary things onto a keyboard, onto looking at a screen. I'm doing something real. I'm building, marble floors and concrete and scaffolding and walkways and making things of significance.
Which is why there's a supply of labor, right?
Well, yeah, but it's also, it strikes me as unfair because there's other jobs like, I don't know, university president or, various kinds of being a professor or, building public policy.
Yeah, those are all bullshit jobs.
Well, so sometimes they're bullshit jobs, but sometimes they're like really interesting and exciting, and yet those people get paid very high salaries, and there's actually lots of people who are probably qualified for that job, but they've created this whole Rube Goldberg thing to sort of, some people make it to the top of that little hierarchy, but they're not necessarily any more qualified than you or me. They might actually be less qualified. Based on most public policy that I'm seeing, they're definitely less qualified than you or me. I mean, we could probably do a better job by throwing darts at a board.
We're not very diverse, though, so we're not going to get the job.
Right. We're not. I don't know, black enough or trans enough or whatever it is. So fine, but I think there's values underneath. So when you said, I want to hesitate on doing a UBI until we kind of do it more carefully. Let's try to figure out a little difference between the reasons that I love the UBI. Let's not confuse the ends and the means. I see the UBI as a means that might hopefully produce some ends that I really support, which would be upward pressure on the wages of jobs that are really shitty but still need to get done, right? Like
maybe
our society would stop functioning without janitors and sewage and
yes. Certainly.
people taking care of old disabled people and whatever. And I don't like the idea that they get paid minimum wage very often. But
let's can we engage in that piece of the thought experiment for a second?
yeah.
Okay. So a janitor, right? Right now gets paid whatever the employer can get away with paying them, basically, the lowest amount possible, right? Because it's not a very skilled job, but it needs to be done.
It absolutely needs to be done. And I wouldn't say most people don't want to do it. It's honest work, as they say. It's not a bullshit job. It's a shitty job.
Right. Most people, though, would not want to do that job. Like, hey, would you like to be a janitor for low wage? The answer is no, thank you. Right.
But enough people say yes because of the coercion. Arguably because of the coercion.
Okay. So now you go and give everybody enough money, in your estimation, to live on. Right. Now,
Yes.
Who does the janitorial work?
So in the theory of the UBI,
so let's start with let's say janitorial today is $10 an hour, just for numbers' sake, not that it's real.
Sure.
Just kind of keep an illustrated example, right? So a guy makes $10 an hour. Now we're distributing a UBI, which is enough we've determined to live on. Now the janitor, now for $10 an hour, I might not want to go and do the hard work because I get paid enough to sit at home and not work, right? So what your answer is, so the employer that needs the janitor will have to increase the price that he's willing to pay for labor in order to coax a janitor off the couch, right?
Correct.
Okay. So now at whatever price that clears, and I don't know what the answer is. So let's say it's $15 an hour for argument's sake. At $15, a guy who wants to sit on the couch at 10 is sitting on the couch. At 15, he's getting up to go work. Okay. No, let's follow that up the chain, right? That janitor cleans a restaurant, right? So the restaurant owner needs a janitor. They need somebody to clean the floors. They need somebody to clean the kitchen. They need somebody to do all this work, right? It can't not do it because that would be unsanitary, right? They need somebody to clean the bathrooms, etc. So now they're paying $15. Where does that extra $5 come from?
Correct. I think even without a UBI, that question has been answered to some extent in places like Australia and Denmark, where wages, even without a UBI, have been driven up quite a bit for things like janitorial staff. It hasn't broken their economy. Those are high cost of living. I don't know if those are any higher cost of living than Los Angeles or San Francisco, but that might be for different reasons.
Yeah, I'm in no position to discuss the local economics of anywhere in Australia. I've never been there, and I don't know that much about it. And I'm not 100% sure that I know kind of the history of their. I'm not aware of their history of their kind of minimum wage, et cetera. But the fundamental question comes back to the same thing. And I'm not saying it breaks the economy, but I'm saying that this is why I say it needs to be done with caution, because it's easy to say, right? Let's just give everybody enough money to live on. And then that will allow the value of labor to float, right? Higher. But when you float the value of labor higher, what you're doing is increasing prices.
Not necessarily, because there's other things that if you have a UBI, wages for and you have no minimum wage, remember, right? To me, those are tied together. I would never agree to a UBI without removing the minimum wage completely. So let's say, for example, you have the minimum wage and labor can float. Well, it might actually emerge, I think it would be very likely, that a lot of people would take jobs that are less than the minimum wage, would take jobs working for projects they love, archaeological digs or startups or artistic projects or whatever. And those, the wage pressure would be downward because there's probably a lot more people who would want to do that work and make some money, even if it's not no money. Like me working at that archaeological dig a couple months ago, I felt like that was a little bit this example. To me, moving back to Israel meant that I had my health care paid for. So that de facto, I wasn't quite a UBI, but it was a huge difference in my base.
Mm-hmm.
My base was covered. For $30 a month, I have good health care here with very little copays or anything else. So
Look,
that meant
I think the Israeli healthcare system is great.
Right. I could choose to do a job that I, so to speak, enjoyed day to day or cared more about, and paid a lot less because my base was covered. Whereas if my base wasn't covered, I wouldn't feel like I even would have had that choice. So some wages, and actually, you know, the archaeological dig, like any construction job, I don't know half of it, but like a tenth of it, let's say, is basically janitor work. I'm sweeping, I'm mopping, I'm cleaning up, I'm picking up garbage, I'm hauling garbage to the dumpster. That was a significant chunk of my work, and I didn't mind it because it was in this context. So I think that there would be downward pressure on wages, and you would just have a different right. emergence of what businesses were more successful based on a different set of values. And that's what's interesting to me.
So the important point, and this is why I always I caution care in your statement, was I think, and I'm not invalidating your thoughts or your opinions. It's entirely possible that you might be right, but it's also entirely possible that you might be wrong. And so this is why I recommend exercising great care in engaging in this conversation, et cetera. Now, to me, kind of similar to what you were saying as far as UBI goes, I think that UBI makes sense in the context where I read a study a number of years ago. I don't remember the gentleman's name who put it out, but that if you took all of the entitlements in the United States and you eliminated them, right, and you replaced it with a UBI, right,
it would cost less.
It would cost less, and you could even get a tax credit. And this guy had this whole theory that you enforced healthcare purchase, right, at a certain dollar amount of that UBI, right? And I would go a step further and say you could give people tax credits if they forego the UBI against it, or whatever. But like, there are ways to do it that might make sense and actually cost less to society than the current system. But it needs to be. I don't trust the actors that lead our society forward to engage in this. Even they can't even engage in the simple conversations, let alone this kind of very complex, nuanced thing that would need to be kind of phased in over time. And I know you don't like this. Yeah. I know you don't like this because when we talked about UBI, we had this conversation about the earned income tax credit as a kind of a gateway to UBI. And I think that you have to find ways to dribble it in slowly, and you have to sell a framework over time and say, hey, this is a vision. This is the direction we want to go, right, as society, because we believe, Andrew Yang was out there with his freedom dividend in the Democratic primary. It requires a broad, overarching vision and an assurance of care. And none of that is possible in our current political environment.
Well, okay, so let's agree that I totally agree with you that our current leaders should all be catapulted into the middle of the ocean and made to swim back. So I don't have any problem.
You're way too generous.
Right. I don't have any problem with saying that I wouldn't trust our current leaders to implement anything like this. But I think we do need to have this conversation now. For one thing, because it's not just, I think this would work. There's pieces of evidence from a lot of different things about the effect of these type incentives. Alaska has its oil dividend for all its residents. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Finland, Switzerland nearly passed a referendum of a UBI. Andrew Yang put it on the radar for a lot of people. And then coronavirus made it a living reality, just not by the same name and not done, how do you say, lahatchila, not done in a way that was actually planned carefully. I absolutely agree that a hazard of a UBI is similar to the hazard of federal guaranteed student loans, that if you guarantee some sort of minimum number, but you don't have any, I don't want to say controls, because it's not quite the way I want to think about it, but they raised student loan guarantees, and then colleges just raised tuition by that exact amount. So it wound up, instead of being a help for students, it wound up just being a giant giveaway to universities. So if you had a UBI and then every landlord raised rent by that exact amount, you'd just have made a massive giveaway to landlords, or cost of goods or whatever. So you definitely need to do it. Carefully isn't even the right word. So this is part of what I'm worried about right now, is because of coronavirus and because of printing all this money and all this stimulus, we're doing this. We're giving away that amount of money, or we're making liquidity available to banks, or we're doing this, we're backing into it without any philosophy. And it's causing inflation, which maybe it's inevitable, but I think this is going to be a humanitarian disaster. I mean, there's no amount of UBI or raising a minimum wage that is going to help people if there's hyperinflation. Like, that's just going to be, I mean, you don't have to look very far. Israel had it in the mid 80s. Colombia is experiencing, well, actually, that's not hyperinflation. They just went up, their currency dropped by 25%. But that's enough to be a massive disaster and cause huge amounts of protesting and difficulties. Venezuela had hyperinflation. Argentina, Indonesia, Russia, Thailand. A lot of these countries have had hyperinflation, and they, ask anyone who went through it. It's hellish. It's hellish. You feel like you're losing everything. So
the bigger problem with that is actually on the supply side as well. So the United States is currently pumping more and more dollars into the economy at the same time we have supply shortages across a lot of different areas and sectors. And if that's what scares me, right? Is we're printing all this money right now and putting it in the hands directly of people, which, argue you like it or you don't like it, fine. But right now, couple that with, there's a shortage in semiconductors. There's a shortage in shipping availability. There's a shortage in at the moment. Just this weekend, there's a pipeline shutdown, so there's a shortage of gasoline. When you couple more dollars in people's pockets with shortages of basic goods, you get massive inflation. That's where it comes from. You cannot buy an automobile today. Like my brother was out shopping for minivans 2 weekends ago, and he drove to 6 different dealerships and called 6 others, right? And of those places, he saw 2 cars, and those cars were selling for a premium over their MSRP, when typically you buy cars at a discount to MSRP.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the early phases of Corona created a chip shortage, right? And now, for want of a $5 part, automobile production is way down. Ford and GM are idling production. In the second quarter of this year, they're going to produce 50% of the automobiles that they projected that they were going to produce before the pandemic. And that's not including the fact that demand has increased now because people have more money in their pockets and people are afraid of public transportation. So the demand for cars went way up.
Yes. I do think even with all of the distortions that are going on, there are still plenty of market dynamics there. And over the course of a year or two, that demand will provoke all the factories and everybody else to get going and produce the things that'll fill that demand. Because it'll be worth doing. You can make a lot of money selling those things.
This is why the market economy, capitalism, is fundamentally a boom and bust environment.
Say more about the bust.
So this is a reality of the business cycle. If you go and take macroeconomics, or to some extent microeconomics might cover it as well, but you learn about what's called the business cycle, right? And so for those who don't know what the business cycle is, right, is there's the way an economy runs through over and under supply. So you can pick where to start from the cycle, but let's start from the bottom, right? And you're in a recession, and so production is down. But then things get cheap enough that people start to invest. And so then demand kind of rises slowly over time. And then people catch that demand and they say, oh, there's all this demand for cars. So let me produce more cars. Right. So now I'm producing more cars and it's costing me more and more to produce cars. Right. And so then I overproduce cars and I have to sell them for too high a price. And there's more cars in the market than people want. Right.
And so the price of cars drops. And then,
so then the price of cars, the price of cars drops. And so then I stop producing, and that's the bust part of the cycle. And then what happens though, eventually that works itself out because all those extra cars got sold and people still need cars, right? So then the demand for price starts to rise again, right? So I, as a producer, start to produce more cars, right? And since you're in an economy where all of these different moving pieces are made up of the decisions of all of these individuals, right? By nature and definition, you are going to see booms and busts. That undersupply oversupply dynamic is called the business cycle, and you multiply that by all of the different actors and all of the different sectors of an economy, and that's how you end up with recessions and booms.
Well, this also comes back to flexibility. How quickly can you move from production to distribution? How quickly can you slow down and speed up? How easy is it for you to physically move? Because all of these dynamics are going on in several sectors of the economy, usually not all at once, although they're not independent. So maybe there's a huge demand for stocks and not a huge demand for bonds. And then that drives up production of the industries where people are buying stocks. And then those companies have more capital and they invest more in production and. But then that leads to California being a more desirable place to move to until it becomes not a more desirable place to move to for all these other reasons. How easy is it for you to pick up and leave your house in the LA basin and move to Texas? If it's really difficult, or is it even legal for you to pick up from California and move to Vancouver, British Columbia? Because if we really had a free market of labor, which used to be the Koch brothers' perspective, the conservatives were in favor of free movement of immigrants across borders. Somehow that just got flipped right about, I don't know what it was, November 4th, 2016. Suddenly every Democrat declared they were in favor of free immigration, and every Republican went along with Trump and said, let's build a wall. The ideal of a free market, I think, needs a free movement of labor. And I think, I've always thought this about jobs. If you're not free to turn down a job, if you, quote, need a job to live, I feel like it's actually not a free market of wages. That's one of the reasons I've always felt like even if it means choosing to be homeless, you should turn down a job if it's shitty, if you don't like it.
That's a choice. That's a choice individuals get to make. It's an ordering priorities. I want to say something that I think I always find interesting, because it ties into the broader conversation. I don't remember who to attribute this quote to. I apologize, but basically the concept is you can either have a welfare state with tight borders, or you can have a not a free market state with loose borders. But you can't have the opposite. You can't have open borders and a welfare state. It's not going to work. Like if you start offering UBI and an open border, then it just where does that end up?
Right. Intuitively, it makes sense. I mean, I could see a circumstance like Alaska. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Alaska was its own country. Well, it's like Norway, maybe. It's like you're making so much money from your natural resources, but you don't have enough people to do the jobs you need to do to even have the economy that you have. So not only are you offering a sort of, not a full UBI, but you're offering this sort of annual stipend for anyone who's a resident of Alaska, but you're actually incentivizing people to move up there. And I believe Norway was like this for a while.
But the only damper on that is the weather, right? Because if the weather was temperate in Alaska, you'd have so many people there that would tax the natural resources and would eliminate the dividend or the value of the dividend. But then again, it might increase the local economy.
Well, Norway, I think, had similar oil resources to Alaska, and they had so
They
much money that they refused
tried
to
to
be part
emigrate
of
to
Europe.
Norway.
Well, you can't easily emigrate there for ordinary reasons, but they took in a large number of refugees from the Middle East and stuff, and I think Sweden and Denmark did also. So
How's that
they
working?
are
And how's that
dealing with
working
the
out for
problem.
them?
Well, that's a good question, and I think the headlines come from the ways that it's not working out, but for every one story of some Syrian Muslim who moved there and stayed or became radicalized, there probably are 5 or 6 who became Europeanized and moderate and educated and assimilated into European society. But that doesn't make for good stories or headlines.
No, I actually
can't speak to the
I wasn't
trade-off.
even asking about the religion aspect of it. I was just asking about the kind of the economic aspect. If you increase your population dramatically and you have a very high welfare state, right? What happens to your ability to create that and keep fuel that welfare state is the question. I don't know the answer to that question.
I don't know the answer either.
I'd be curious to take a look at studies that isolate that and see if there's value there. The classic response to the Norwegian and Swedish model, which they vigorously defend and tell the American left that we're not what you think we are, is that it is kind of a monolithic culture that has very specific fundamentals and it works for them. But whether or not that's exportable to a larger society that's a lot more dynamic and much more diverse is a very solid question. And I think that analyzing the impact of adding a large subset minority of people that are from a different culture would be interesting. I don't know where things are at. I'm just pointing interesting questions. I don't have answers.
No, that's a great question. Look, I mean, I think America has an opportunity that de facto a country like Israel or Norway or Singapore or Hong Kong, we can do these sort of small scale experiments, but we have our own problems with them. But America has both a federal and a state level and city and whatever that it seems like somehow there's a missed opportunity for United States states to genuinely have the leeway to do experiments. I mean, a lot of the best things that happened in America was from Massachusetts had a successful experiment with healthcare, and that led to them trying to implement it nationally with somewhat less success. Vermont also, and Hawaii, I think, had socialized healthcare. Texas has no state income tax. California has a high state income tax. It's like if they actually went deep down the road of like shrinking the federal government, like that would ever happen, and really letting the states try to run their own experiments, I could see that way being a sort of non-partisan way to just experiment and get out of this insanity.
Yeah, I mean, our federal government should exist for primary and basic functions. We should not have a Department of Education. I don't know why we do. We spend a ton of money on it, but schools are funded locally, right? The local public school is funded through my property tax dollars. So why do I need a federal agency to worry about education? It just creates administrative bloat and creates all kinds of problems. And I think that, yes, shrinking the federal government is an excellent idea. The federal government should be involved. I mean, you can make arguments for other areas, but largely the collective defense. That should be pretty much it. Interstates, interstate roads. Other than that, leave everything to the states. I am a firm states' rights advocate because then you're a citizen of the United States. You have the freedom of mobility. You can move from California to Texas if that's what you want to do, and lots of people are doing. Mind you, California is busy cooking up ways that they can figure out how to legally tax your income even after you leave the state of California if you ever once lived in California, which is crazy. But that's what's happening is they're seeing the drain on their resources and they're going, wait a minute, I didn't mean for all you rich people to leave. I just wanted to take all your money. And lo and behold, rich people go, I'm really not sure I want to give the state of California all my money.
Well, you said a couple key words there that I think are really important to this. and it's both private and public, but it's an administrative bloat. Um, in private industry, you see this with things like, Comcast and Verizon sort of, they have a legal monopoly or semi-monopoly on various services, and they make so much money from that they use that money to pay off politicians to maintain their legal monopoly of it. And that's driven not just by a few greedy investors, but the entire class of people who work for this inefficient company doing nothing of importance. Same thing with universities, who are sort of private and public. Same thing with state governments, of course, which is public. You have a tremendous amount of bureaucrats. I mean, when you mentioned before, like if you just removed all entitlement programs and just replaced it with a UBI, well, you're not just taking the money that's spent on those entitlement programs, you're firing hundreds of thousands of people who work administrating those programs. Millions of people. I mean, I think they're the perfect first candidates to start living off the UBI. But it's deeper than that, because a lot of people don't want to work, but they want a job. They want a job that has no accountability.
They don't want to work, but they want to get paid, is what you mean to say. They don't want a job. Yeah. They want a paycheck.
Yeah, and look, this is why people sometimes hate, so to speak, capitalists. I'll use that term loosely. People who invested in something and then make money off of their investments. Now, and I know that it's pretty rare for an investor to make lots of money without doing some work. Even if a lot of that work is on the front end, like before they even invest the money, they put a lot of effort and
blood, sweat, and tears.
Blood, sweat, and tears into deciding where to invest.
But which goes back to your meme, by the way, because I mean, there are all these elements of your meme that are kind of out there, but in one corner of it, it says, and I can pull it back up in a second. Share screen, and it's this one. It says here, I love feeling that my only value to society is based on the work I put out while watching the top 1% earn hundreds of billions of dollars during a global pandemic. And like, first of all, no, the 1% did not, quote, earn hundreds of billions of dollars. They made hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think that understanding the difference between earning and making is important. And I apologize, I'm going to have to go shortly, but I think this is kind of a good topic to kind of wrap up on anyway. In that Jeff Bezos, who I think is one of the richest men in the world, he's one of, if he's not the richest, he made hundreds of billions of dollars billions of dollars during a global pandemic. And he made that money because he had previously invested in building a company that literally brought everybody through the pandemic. Imagine if we would have had the level of lockdown without Amazon. Like, how integral was Amazon to your life if you live in America last March and April? So much so that when the supply times drew out to a couple of weeks from a couple of days, it impacted you. Like, my kids went without shoes for a while, right? Until I could get Amazon to deliver, because everything else was closed. And so the 1% makes their money because they've invested capital. And what we do very, very poorly as a society is educate our young people in the understanding and importance of building capital. And anybody can do it. It's hard. Okay. It requires, to quote Dave Ramsey, who I'm a even though I have tremendous disagreements with him on business, I'm a very big fan of the advice he dispenses to most people. Your greatest wealth building tool is your income. And so if you are out there watching this and you are in control of your own destiny, what I recommend that you do, if you're finding yourself in a tough situation, is take your skills. If you're in Southern California, leave. Go to a place where you can make money and live on less than you make, and then take the difference and invest it. Don't get the newest iPhone. Don't drive a Lexus, right? I mean, the part of we have a consumer choice problem as much as we have any other problem. And I know that that's oversimplifying, and that's not everything. That's not the be all end all, right? But quite frankly, if people made different choices, they would have different outcomes.
I have two quick thoughts. One is people's movement. It may not be as inflexible as moving real estate. You can't actually move your house from Los Angeles to Nevada if you want to, because it doesn't move. It's on the ground. People, an individual might feel like they want to move to a different job market, but their wife doesn't, or their kids are in school, or their kids are autistic and have a special program they're supported and they can't leave it. So I have family members who are in that situation and they just can't leave New Jersey because that's where they get, the support they need. So humans are not quite as flexible as Dave Ramsey's ideal. And I'm sure he knows that. I mean, in the ideal, yes. The second thing is that there's 1% and there's 1%. And I totally get resenting the 1% who don't, quote, earn it. And what I mean by earn it is take risks. I do respect a Jeff Bezos. I might not like the way he treats his warehouse workers, but he's a tech entrepreneur. He took risks and he made billions of dollars. And I was a tech entrepreneur. I wanted to make billions of dollars. I didn't succeed, but I respect that path to success. And I think this is also why a lot of Americans who do resent rich people didn't resent Trump, because they see someone who very publicly took large risks and lost lots and lots of money, and made money, but also lost money and really took risks. There are some members of the 1% who I don't think took real market risks. I think especially like cable television billionaires and stuff like that, paid off the government, lobbying, 1996 Telecommunications Act and stuff like that to basically get legal monopolies that made them billions with no competition, no accountability, crappy service. I mean, I blame them not just for making lots of money, but for America falling well behind other parts of the world because they didn't have any incentive to actually improve the service to your houses. So I resent that part of the 1% who
As do I.
Yeah.
But you know what the prescription for that is?
Free market and
shrink the government. You know why there's government corruption? Because the government has a huge pot of money that it plays with and distributes. And as long as you have a huge pot of money that you're distributing for free, that you're taking from people at threat of violence, then you're going to have corruption. That's just the reality of it. How you deal with it and how you respond to that is there are different ways. But by and large, if you shrink the federal government, most of those problems disappear.
Maybe. That's like saying that I think the appropriate thing would be to say, you think.
Oh, sure. That's my thought. That's correct. Yeah. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Fair. Awesome.
But everything I say on here is my opinion. That's all right. I know. I can tell
you called me out on the UBI being.
No, you are 100% correct. 100%. I agree. It is an I think. I believe that the pathway, as I kind of mentioned before about pathways to prosperity, and I recognize that it's oversimplification, and it's not that easy, and many people have externalities that they face and decisions as they make decisions. But if you want to fix a lot of the problems that we face as a society, I think I think, right, and this is my bias, less government intervention is generally better than more. And that's because when you have more, you create more perverse incentives and unintended consequences.
Yeah, not that big companies need government help necessarily to make monopolies. There's some Pareto distributions like Standard Oil that weren't.
Antitrust. Antitrust should certainly continue to be a function of the federal government. I'm all in favor.
Interesting exception. Yeah, and that's what I think of. I mean, I don't know if shrinking the size of the government would cure Verizon and Comcast and whatever. I mean, I think that Chinese style
T-Mobile is curing Verizon on their own network.
Yes, and Cricket, they're slowly becoming competition. I think that a Chinese style show trial of James Dolan, not just for being a cable television billionaire, but also for running the Knicks into the ground, would be an appropriate use of the federal government's time and resources. But we'll probably have to agree to disagree on Chinese style show trials for billionaires. Anyway.
Well, I think that you're just tapping into populism at that point, and that's just kind of my opinion. But Look,
Well, then I would say populism is a market dynamic and it's a response to market inefficiencies.
oh, it absolutely is. Absolutely is.
We need a dose of it.
Sure. I
It's like a
mean, look,
vaccine, to use a
I,
particularly inappropriate analogy.
I have no interest in being dictator for a day or even a minute or permanently, because most dictators don't really want to give up that day. But I mean, I can only tell you how I would think about solving complex issues, um, and kind of my general beliefs based on decades of experience and reading uh, lead me to certain conclusions, and you have your decades of experience that lead you to slightly different conclusions. And I think that we frequently manage to come together and find common ground through having conversations. And I think that's the important part. As we, even though we don't agree and we find plenty to disagree on, we've agreed on a number of things in this conversation. I think, right? One is that wage is not necessarily the issue. It's kind of a throwaway, um, politically expedient lever to try to pull, but not really solving the problems. And that's a huge set of agreement between somebody who voted for Donald Trump on one side of the screen and somebody who probably wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders or further left on the other. So that's great, and I think that as Americans and as citizens of the world, we need to come together and have more and more of these conversations where we can find areas and elements of common ground, because we're not as divided as a people as the red team, blue team dichotomy would like us to think. And to me, that's why I'm here once a week for about an hour and a half, or try to be. And that's why you and I got together and wrote this book, because that's the only way forward.
I mean, yeah. And I think that,
Final thoughts.
yeah, we pulled apart assumptions because we didn't assume that we were disagreeing. We tried to figure out what the words meant, whether it was wages or billionaires or the 1%. And, I think we each realized that we were meaning those terms slightly differently until we pulled it apart. And I hope those sort of conversations start happening between the people who are, I think one of our points of agreement is that whoever's running our society is running it into the ground very quickly. And there's a lot of dangers to that, not just hyperinflation, but strife in the streets and a breakdown of our world distribution and production system that we all depend on. And, hopefully this sort of thinking penetrates a little bit enough people's minds that they start listening to each other and stop assuming that they know all the answers. Because I think it's getting more urgent every day for this sort of nuanced listening to many other sides of the conversation start to happen.
Agreed. So buy our book.
Our book is called I Do Not Think That Word Means What You Think It Means, a short handbook of misunderstanding.
Buy it because it's funny and fun and supports a good cause.
Available on Amazon. Also, our podcast will be up on YouTube and on Spotify, I think iTunes podcast, all the places where it'll be.
All right.